It happened last winter, during the coldest December I can remember. I was 18, and it was my first time being home alone for an extended period. My parents had gone on a week-long cruise to celebrate their anniversary, leaving me in charge of the house and our dog, Max. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by snowy woods. The kind of place that felt serene during the day and oppressive at night. It started innocently enough. For the first few days, I basked in my newfound freedom, eating junk food, staying up late, and binge-watching shows in the living room. Max, our golden retriever, was my only company, and he spent most of his time lounging at my feet. It was peaceful, even cozy, but that peace wouldn't last. The first strange thing happened on the third night. I was curled up on the couch, halfway through a horror movie, when Max suddenly lifted his head, ears perked. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room, where the wall met the ceiling. At first, I didn't think much of it. Dogs are weird, right? But then he started growling, low and guttural, the kind of growl that made my skin crawl. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond, just kept staring at that spot on the wall. I paused the movie and listened. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the furnace kicking on. I stood up and walked over to the corner, feeling ridiculous. Of course, there was nothing there. But Max wouldn't stop growling. His eyes followed something I couldn't see, as if it was moving along the wall. I grabbed his collar and gently tugged him away. "Come on, it's nothing," I said, leading him upstairs to my room. He reluctantly followed, but he kept glancing back over his shoulder. That night, I barely slept. Every little creak of the house made my heart race. Max lay at the foot of my bed, occasionally letting out soft whines. I told myself he was just picking up on my nerves. The next day passed uneventfully. I shoveled the driveway, did some laundry, and tried to shake off the eerie feeling from the night before. By evening, I was starting to feel normal again. I made myself a bowl of popcorn and settled in for another movie. But then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, coming from inside the wall. At first, I thought it might be mice. The house was old, and we'd had rodent problems in the past. I turned off the TV and listened closely. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging against the drywall. Max heard it too. He sat up straight, his ears twitching. This time, he didn't growl. He just stared at the wall, his body tense. "Great," I muttered. "Mice." I got up and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it. The scratching stopped. I knocked lightly on the drywall, hoping to scare off whatever was in there. Silence. I shrugged it off and went back to the couch. But as soon as I sat down, the scratching started again. Louder this time, and closer. It didn't sound like mice anymore. It sounded intentional. Max jumped off the couch and barked, his tail stiff. I grabbed my phone and called my dad, even though I knew he wouldn't be much help from the middle of the ocean. "Probably just a squirrel or something," he said casually. "I'll check it out when we get back." I hung up, feeling unsatisfied. I turned up the volume on the TV and tried to ignore the noise, but it was impossible. The scratching seemed to move, traveling from one wall to the next, as if something was crawling inside the house. That night, I decided to sleep downstairs. The living room felt safer, somehow, with Max by my side and the front door in view. I barricaded the door to the basement with a chair, just in case, and left a few lights on. Max curled up on the rug, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of Max barking furiously. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, disoriented. He was standing at the edge of the living room, facing the hallway that led to the kitchen. His barking was so frantic, so desperate, that it sent chills down my spine. "Max, stop," I hissed, but he ignored me. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the hallway, my hands shaking. The house was eerily silent now, except for Max's low growls. I shined the flashlight down the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. But it was empty, and then I saw it. The basement door, which I had barricaded with a chair, was wide open. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact that I had wedged that chair under the handle. There was no way it could have opened on its own. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Someone was in the house. They had to be. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but it would take at least 10 minutes for them to arrive. 10 minutes felt like an eternity. I locked myself and Max in the upstairs bathroom, clutching a kitchen knife I had grabbed on the way. My ears strained to hear any sound, but the house was deathly quiet. Too quiet. And then, just as I was starting to think I had imagined it all, I heard the creak of footsteps on the stairs. My blood turned to ice. Whoever it was, they were coming up to the second floor. I tightened my grip on the knife, tears streaming down my face. Max growled low in his throat, his body pressed against mine. The footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the whisper, "I know you're in there." The voice was hoarse and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. My entire body was trembling. Max barked furiously, but I clamped a hand over his muzzle, afraid the noise would provoke whoever, or whatever, was on the other side. I held my breath as the doorknob rattled. It turned, but I had locked it. There was a moment of pause, and then the door shook violently as if someone was throwing their entire weight against it. I screamed, clutching Max tightly. "Get out of my house!" I shrieked, trying to sound braver than I felt. The pounding stopped abruptly. For a few agonizing moments, there was silence. Then, I heard the footsteps retreating, moving back down the stairs. I stayed in that bathroom until the police arrived. When they searched the house, they found no signs of forced entry. No footprints in the snow outside. No evidence that anyone had been there at all. The basement, however, was another story. The officers found a series of tunnels hidden behind a false wall. The tunnels were narrow and dark, stretching deep beneath the house. And in one of them, they found an old sleeping bag, some food wrappers, and a journal. The journal's pages were filled with ramblings, disjointed thoughts about watching and waiting. One line, scrawled over and over again, sent shivers down my spine. "They'll never see me in the walls." My parents sold the house a month later. We never found out who had been living there, or for how long. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of scratching, and I wonder if they ever really left. It was the summer of 2017 when my parents bought a fixer-upper on Ravenhill Road, a quiet street on the outskirts of town. The house was old, creaky, and sat on an overgrown lot surrounded by thick trees. They got it cheap, and my dad was thrilled about the prospect of renovating it. To me, though, it was the kind of house you'd see in a horror movie, tall, shadowy, and utterly silent. That summer, my parents were both working late hours to pay for the renovations. I was 17 and old enough to stay home alone, but I hated it. The house felt too big, too empty, and too alive in its stillness. One Wednesday night, my parents left for a company event. My mom promised they'd be back by midnight, and I wasn't thrilled about being alone for the next few hours. I set myself up in the living room with my laptop and some popcorn, hoping to distract myself with a movie. The house had other plans. It started with the sounds. About an hour into the movie, I thought I heard a door creak upstairs. I paused the video, straining to hear, but all was quiet. I brushed it off and pressed play, turning the volume up to drown out my nerves. But then I heard it again, a distinct creak, like the floorboards groaning under someone's weight. I muted the laptop and stared at the ceiling, my heart thudding in my chest. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, even though I knew they weren't home. No answer. I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend, Tara. "I swear I just heard something upstairs." Her reply came almost immediately. "Don't be dramatic. It's probably the house settling." She was probably right. The place was old and full of quirks, and I was letting my imagination run wild. But just as I was about to text back, I heard another sound. A faint thud, like something falling onto the floor. I froze. This time, it wasn't just the house settling. I debated calling the police, but I knew how stupid I'd sound. Instead, I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and decided to investigate. I was nervous, but I told myself I'd feel better if I just proved to myself there was nothing there. The staircase creaked under my weight as I ascended, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand. At the top of the stairs, The air felt colder, heavier. I told myself it was just the draftiness of the old house, but it didn't make me feel any less uneasy. I checked my parents' room first. Nothing. Their bed was made, and everything was exactly as they'd left it. Next was the bathroom. Empty. Finally, I reached the spare bedroom at the end of the hall. This room always gave me the creeps. It was unfurnished, with peeling wallpaper and a single window that overlooked the backyard. The door was open just a crack. I nudged it open with my foot, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, save for a few cardboard boxes my dad had stored there. I let out a shaky laugh. See? Nothing, I whispered to myself. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the boxes in the corner was overturned. Its contents spilled onto the floor. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I couldn't ignore it. I stepped closer, shining the flashlight on the mess. The box had been full of old tools, hammers, wrenches, and screws. Nothing too unusual, but the fact that it had been knocked over was unsettling. I knelt down to pick up one of the wrenches, and that's when I saw it. Footprints. Faint but unmistakable. A trail of muddy footprints led from the window to the doorway. My chest tightened as I realized the window was slightly ajar. I bolted back downstairs, locking the front door and every window I could find. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the locks. I called Tara and told her everything. She laughed at first, but when I mentioned the footprints, her tone changed. "Call the cops," she said firmly. I hung up and was about to dial 911 when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were coming from the basement. I froze, gripping the phone so tightly I thought it might shatter. My first instinct was to run out of the house, but something inside me, the same stupid bravery that got me upstairs in the first place, made me stay. I crept toward the basement door, my heart pounding in my ears. The door was slightly ajar, and as I reached for the handle, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs. I slammed the door shut and locked it, bracing myself against it as if my weight could stop whoever, or whatever, was down there. I called 911, whispering frantically into the phone. The operator assured me help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. Then the knocking started. Soft at first, then louder, more frantic. Someone, or something, was pounding on the other side of the door. "Let me out," a voice rasped. It didn't sound human. It was low, guttural, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in years. I backed away from the door, my entire body trembling. The knocking stopped, replaced by a sickening silence. And then I heard the whisper, "You can't hide forever." I bolted out of the house, not stopping until I reached the street. A few minutes later, the police arrived. They searched the house top to bottom, but found no sign of anyone. The basement was empty, the footprints had vanished, and the window in the spare room was shut tight. They told me it was probably just a prank or my imagination, but I knew better. I could still hear that voice in my head, taunting me. That was the last night I ever stayed in that house alone. My parents thought I was being ridiculous, but I didn't care. I started sleeping over at Tara's place whenever they worked late, and I never set foot in the basement again. A few weeks later, my dad was fixing up the spare room when he found something hidden behind the peeling wallpaper. A small, rusted key. We never figured out what it opened, but sometimes I still wonder if it had something to do with that night. The night I learned that some houses are better left alone. I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, where nothing ever seemed to happen. My family lived in a modest two-story house on the outskirts of town, bordered by dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. I had always thought of those woods as both fascinating and terrifying, beautiful during the day, but pitch black and unnerving at night. One Friday evening, my parents went out for dinner and a late movie, leaving me alone for the night. I was 16, and though I like to think of myself as independent, being alone in that creaky old house still made me uneasy. Around 9 p.m., I was in the living room watching TV when I heard a noise from the backyard. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the trees, but the sound was persistent, a soft tapping on the glass of the sliding door that led to the deck. I froze. My first thought was that it might be our neighbor's dog, Max, who sometimes wandered over. I got up from the couch and cautiously walked over to the door, flipping on the backyard light. But when I peered outside, the deck was empty. I let out a shaky laugh and chalked it up to my imagination. But as I turned to walk back to the couch, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, the sound was louder and more deliberate. I turned around and pressed my face closer to the glass, my breath fogging up the pain. The yard was still empty, but something felt off. The woods beyond the fence seemed darker than usual, as if the night had thickened around them. I decided to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind. I turned off the light and went back to the couch. But before I could even sit down, the tapping resumed, more insistent this time. "Hello?" I called out, instantly regretting it. My voice sounded small and shaky in the stillness of the house. There was no response, but the tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear any other sounds, when something else caught my attention, a faint whisper, coming from the direction of the woods. I moved closer to the door, trying to make out the words, but it was too soft, like the rustling of leaves. I locked the sliding door and pulled the curtains shut, my heart racing. I went back to the couch and grabbed my phone. I texted my best friend, Jake, to tell him what was happening. His reply came almost instantly. "Bro, you're just scaring yourself. Relax." I tried to take his advice, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I turned on the TV again to drown out the silence, but after a while, I started to feel drowsy. I figured if I could just fall asleep, the night would pass quicker. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to complete silence. The TV had turned itself off, and the room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it wasn't coming from the sliding door. It was coming from the window in the kitchen, which faced the woods. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly making my way toward the kitchen. The beam of light wavered as my hand shook. When I reached the kitchen, I stood frozen at the doorway. The tapping had stopped, but the window was wide open. The screen was still in place, so it wasn't like someone had climbed in. But I knew for a fact that I hadn't opened it. I slammed the window shut and locked it, then hurried back to the living room. I texted Jake again, but this time he didn't reply. I sat there, clutching my phone, when I heard something else, a soft, rhythmic creaking coming from upstairs, like footsteps on the floorboards. "Nope," I whispered to myself, standing up so fast I almost knocked over the coffee table. I grabbed the fireplace poker from the hearth and crept up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth in my parents' bedroom. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw that the door to their room was ajar. I stood there, gripping the poker tightly, trying to summon the courage to push the door open. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The creaking stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, from inside the room, a soft whisper, "Come closer." I bolted. I raced down the stairs, out the front door, and into the street. I didn't stop running until I reached the house of my closest neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. I banged on her door until she opened it, her face a mix of concern and confusion. I told her what had happened, and she immediately called the police. When they arrived, they searched the house but found no signs of forced entry and no one inside. The windows and doors were all locked, just as I'd left them. They told me it was probably just a prank or my imagination running wild, but I knew what I'd heard. My parents came home a few hours later, and I told them everything. My dad tried to reassure me, but my mom looked genuinely worried. That night, I slept in their room with the door locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still in the house, watching and waiting. To this day, I refuse to stay home alone, especially at night, and I never, ever leave the windows open.